Perception checking is an interpersonal communication tool. It's a technique that helps us understand the interpersonal communication process. Gudi Konstantin Tumi believed that perception checking is one of the simplest and most powerful techniques we can use to improve the quality of our communication. And while perception checking is not for all situations, it is frequently useful in helping us manage conflict and relational problems that result from misunderstanding another person's motives or actions. Perception checking appears on the surface to be a relatively simple communication tool, but it's a little more complex than it first appears to be. It's a communication tool that not only allows you to understand another person's behavior and motives, it can help clarify for the other person his or her own motives. In addition, it may help clarify your own feelings and motives. So perception checks should work as an invitation to communicate. When we do a perception check well, the other person should want to communicate with us. Using a perception check is a three-part process. Perception checking is not for all situations. It's a tool to use when the issue is important and when the relationship is important. Since the purpose here is to check your own perceptions, perception checking is useful when there's some ambiguity or some reason to believe that you may need to clarify what's going on or what's been said. While perception checking is not for all situations, it can help us prevent conflicts and relational problems that result from misunderstandings or differences in interpretation. One of my students gave this example of a perception checking situation. She was worried about her boyfriend who was living with his mother, who was an alcoholic and had just crashed his new pickup. So she asked him to move in with her, and it was about 3 weeks later and he still hadn't answered her yet, and she wondered what was going on. So you can see there's some ambiguity there, some reason to wonder if she understood. She didn't know if he didn't want to leave his mother alone, if he was worried about moving from home, or if he just didn't want to live with her. On the other hand, one of my other students suggested that this might be a good situation in which to do a perception check. I'm going to make the names up here. My student Tricia had invited friends over for a party, and during the party, she walked into her bedroom, and one of her friends was taking money out of Tricia's wallet. Although this is a situation that you would want to respond to, this probably isn't a situation that calls for a perception check. While the relationship and situation are important, it's pretty unlikely that this was ambiguous or that there was a misunderstanding resulting from differences in interpretations. Most of us know it's not okay to take money out of a friend's wallet. Another important point about perception checking is that you want to be aware of how you say things. When you're doing a perception check, your language should always be tentative or provisional. The major reason your language should be tentative or provisional is because it shows the other person that you haven't already made up your mind. Also, when you're doing a perception check, timing is important. Don't try to do a perception check when someone is upset, whether it's you or the other person, and don't do it if someone is late or running out the door. Take a few minutes. It makes a difference. Perception checking doesn't always work the first time. You need to incorporate it into your relationships and build trust. When you do a perception check, you may end up talking in a way that's different from how you normally interact with the other person, and that may seem strange and make the process more difficult the first time or so. So really what can happen is you feel awkward and the other person is thinking, what's going on here? What is this all about? So sometimes it works just to tell the other person what you're doing, that you want to try something new. If you do, there are 3 steps. I just want to overview the steps here, then we'll go through them each in more detail. So just to overview, perception checking is a 3-step process. First, it's about you telling the other person what you think happened. That's the first step, a description of behavior. Then you tell the other person what you thought the behavior meant. That's the next step, giving at least two interpretations of the behavior, whether it was something someone said or did. Then the next step is where you ask the other person if you understood it the same way she did. That's the request for clarification. You ask the other person to clarify your perceptions. I'd like to look at this again, this time with an example, and then discuss each of the steps more fully. One of my students did a perception check over spring break with her mom. Lori and her husband usually went to her family in South Carolina during winter and spring break. And at first her mom would seem really happy to see them, but after about 2 or 3 days, she didn't seem so happy they were there anymore. So Lori and her husband could tell something was wrong, and they were thinking that maybe they were visiting too often or something, because it really seemed like her mother wanted them to leave. So Lori ended up doing a perception check with her mom, and this is what she said. Mom, I've noticed after we've been here for a couple of days that you seem upset and you often leave the room when Ben and I come in. I was wondering if we're visiting too often or staying too long, or if maybe we're doing something that upsets you. Is it one of those things? The description of behavior should be objective. The description of behavior should only be about the sense data, just the facts. It should be what you saw or heard. At this step, you want to be as objective as possible so that it's only reporting or telling about the behavior, what you saw or heard happen. You shouldn't include your opinions or your interpretations at this point. You get to do that in a minute, but not here. Here in this step, you just tell what you saw or heard. One of the reasons you do this is so that you can have a shared understanding of what you're talking about. You know what you're talking about, and you want the other person to know what you're talking about. Otherwise, you'll never get this figured out. So, for example, Lori said to her mom, "You seem upset. You often leave the room." So they both know the behavior that Lori noticed. The next step, giving at least two interpretations, is where you get to tell the other person what you think is going on. This step is not about the sense data or what you saw or heard. The second step, interpretations, is about what you think is going on. This is your opinion of what you think the behavior meant, what you think is happening. This is helpful for you because it forces you to think about the meaning, and it's helpful for the other person because it lets the other person know what you think he or she meant. When you're doing a perception check, you should always give at least two interpretations of what you think is going on, and there are 3 reasons for that. The first is that it helps you think about possible reasons why the other person may have done or said this thing that's bothering you. You know, most of the time when we feel upset about something that someone's done or said, we just assume that we know why the other person acted that way. We don't usually stop to think about possible different reasons. And if you don't, then you really could be missing something. The second reason is to give 2 interpretations is because it shows the other person that you're really trying to figure it out. At least 2 interpretations shows the other person that you've thought about what happened long enough to consider other possibilities, and most people will appreciate that. The third reason to offer at least 2 interpretations is that it gives the other person options when explaining back to you. If you just offer one interpretation, then the other person is in the rhetorical position of either agreeing or disagreeing. And that's not the best way to get clarification. You want to help the other person talk to you. Your interpretations should be in the form of a statement, not a question. The reason for this is that if you ask a question, that puts the burden on the other person. If you make a tentative or provisional statement, however, then you've taken the cognitive burden and it makes it easier for the other person to answer you. Also, questions, especially questions that begin with the word why, tend to make the other person defensive. If you offer tentative or provisional statements, then that should lessen the likelihood that the other person is going to become defensive. Sometimes people have trouble because they form their interpretations as questions and can't figure out how to make them statements. It's actually pretty easy to turn a question into a tentative statement. Just put an introductory phrase in front of it. For example, the question, "Are you upset with me?" becomes a statement by saying, "I'm worried that you're upset with me." The question, "Why are you so mad at me?" becomes the statement, "I feel as though you're mad at me." So phrases like, "it seems like," "it feels like," "I'm worried that," can be put in front of your question to turn it into a statement. Your interpretations should be specific, accurate, and generous. Specific means that you should talk about the thing that just happened, about what you're concerned about. Don't bring up past behavior or other similar behavior. Just focus on the one thing. If you do that, then you make things more manageable. Most of us can deal with one thing at a time, but it's hard to deal with a lot of things at a time. When you're doing a perception check, it's not a good idea to use the words always or never, because there's nothing anyone can really do about always or never. If you tell someone that they always do something, then the most likely response you're going to get is, "Yeah, you're right, I always do that." Accurate means it really should be about what you think is going on, not about something else. For example, if your partner didn't want to talk to you when he came home last night and you wanted to do a perception check, you might say, "When you came home, I noticed you didn't say hello and you just went into the other room." That would be an okay description of behavior. Two possible interpretations might be, "I thought you might be really tired," or "maybe you were upset with me." And those would be fine interpretations unless, for example, you and your partner had had a terrible fight that morning and you told him that you hated his mother. Then you need to be honest and accurate. If you had said something terrible about your partner's mother, then when you're doing the perception check, you need to say, "I think you're probably still upset with me because of what I said about your mom." That's going to get you a more inviting response from the other person than not being honest. Generous means that you should assume the best in your interpretations, not the worst. You can kind of use yourself as a benchmark. Would you want someone to make that assumption about you? For example, if you said to your partner, "When you left this morning without saying goodbye, I didn't know if that was you being your usual thoughtless, inconsiderate self, or you just don't give a damn about me," those would probably be interpretations that wouldn't work very well. And finally, the interpretations go to the description of behavior. You're interpreting the sense data that you talked about. For example, when Lori was talking to her mom, she offered these interpretations. "I was wondering if we're visiting too often or staying too long, or if maybe we're doing something that upsets you." So you can see Lori actually gave 3 interpretations: too often, too long, doing something that upsets you. She also put the interpretations in the form of a statement, not a question. And they're specific. She didn't say, "You always do this when we come here," or "You never do this when we come here." They're accurate. The interpretations are relevant to the situation, and they're generous. She doesn't make any accusatory or negative interpretations. She's just telling her mom in a positive way what she thinks is going on. This is really kind of the crux of the whole perception check. This is where you actually check to see if your perceptions are correct. The way you do a request for clarification is you ask the other person if your interpretations are correct. The request for clarification should invite the other person to talk to you. It should open up the communication. It should also leave the door open for other interpretations, because the request for clarification is when you ask the other person if you got it. Remember, you're checking your own perceptions, your own interpretations. The request for clarification goes to interpretations because you're trying to figure out if you understand what the other person meant. You do not want to request clarification on the person's behavior. The interpretations go to the other person's behavior. The request for clarification goes to the interpretations. For example, when Lori requested clarification from her mom, she asked a very simple question. Is it one of those things? She didn't ask her mom to explain why she was getting upset. That would be a request to explain behavior, and that's not what you're doing here. She asked her mom if her interpretations were correct. The request for clarification is usually the most effective when it's simple. Questions like, is it one of those things? Am I close? Did I get it? Are all ways to ask for clarification. Lori's mom, by the way, told her that none of her interpretations were correct. She seemed upset because she was sad thinking that Lori and Ben were going to be leaving soon. I want to end by telling you about another perception check that one of my students did. She was a single mom with 4 children, and she was working and going to school. So you can imagine she was really busy. When she would pick up her 6-year-old from school, her daughter would ask her to go to McDonald's, and she said it seemed like this was every day. So, you know, McDonald's isn't exactly an expensive place to eat, but if you go there every day, you end up spending a lot of money. Between that and the time it took, the mom was feeling pretty frustrated. She was pretty sure that her little girl just wanted the toy and the Happy Meal, but she decided to try a perception check with her anyway. When she picked her up from school on a Thursday, her little girl asked to go to McDonald's, so her mom said, Monday and Tuesday you asked to go to McDonald's, and you want to go again today. I'm wondering if you're getting really hungry, or if you really want the toy and the Happy Meal. Is it one of those things? And her little girl said, no, Mom, it's the only time I get to spend alone with you. So you can imagine the effect that that had. Here was a mom who'd been completely annoyed with her kid who wanted Happy Meal toys, who all of a sudden was the mom of a 6-year-old who wanted to spend some time alone with her. So they ended up doing some small thing together every day, whether it was going to the library or the grocery store or McDonald's or whatever, but they always had a few minutes together. The reason I wanted to give you these examples is because I think they really demonstrate what Gudekunst and Ting Toomey say about perception checking, that it's one of the simplest and most powerful tools that we can use to improve the quality of our communication.